I'm Olivia Newton-John, and this is One World. Coming up on One World.
Hello, buenos dias. I'm Olivia Newton-John and welcome to the Galapagos Islands, 600 miles or 1,000 kilometers west of mainland Ecuador. Shakespeare wrote that one touch of nature makes the whole world kin, and it's with this spirit that we come to this magnificent place. It is officially known as the Archipelago de Colón. To some, the Garden of Eden, the beginning of time.
It wasn't always 600 miles away. New evidence from the seafloor suggests that the Galapagos chain once included older islands that have now disappeared beneath the waves. The oldest island, now sunken, is actually 370 miles closer to the mainland. This explains why some of the creatures here, especially marine iguanas like these, seem older than the islands. They had much more time to evolve from a common land ancestor than we previously thought. Clearly, the Galapagos Islands are a classroom for all of us in our one world.
One World with Olivia Newton-John is presented by the Ford Motor Company, proud sponsors of the America's Cup, and made possible in part by the generous support of One World Challenge, pursuing the cup in the name of the health of the world's oceans. Keep the course, guys.
We'll be right back. The Galapagos Islands were once known as Las Encandidas, the Enchanted Islands, not because of their beauty, but their ability to bewitch navigators. The Galapagos were once thought of as a dark, foreboding place. In fact, Herman Melville thought the island's giant tortoises were actually the damned souls of dead pirates, entombed in these massive creatures, a type of living hell. Other writers told of the evils that lurked in and around these waters. Now remember, that was hundreds of years ago. It was a different world back then. Here were these spectacular islands, a land of erupting volcanoes, ruled by reptiles, seemingly habitable by people. And yet when the first explorers arrived here, they found no humans. And they thought to themselves, well, if man can't live here, and these islands are ruled by reptiles, well, they must be evil. Certainly it didn't help that the first regulars here were pirates and buccaneers like William Dampier, who used the islands as a staging area for their ruthless raids on the mainland. The Galapagos became, in the eyes of the world, a portal for both lost ships and lost souls, certainly a place to avoid. And it stayed that way for hundreds of years. But then, in 1835, the groundwork was laid for an entirely new perception of these islands, and for that matter, our world. It was, of course, the famous visit of Charles Darwin and the HMS Beagle that turned the world's attention to the Galapagos. Darwin was a medical student dropout who somehow convinced the owner of the ship and his father to allow him to come along. But his tireless collecting of plants and animals and his careful, insightful observations over that 5-year voyage, especially the 5 weeks he spent in the Galapagos, turned our understanding of natural history on its ear. His theories on evolution are perhaps the most influential in all of science. Next on One World.
Tell me about this face. What is that? Are they teeth?
Yeah, what we're looking at here is they have a beak like a bird, and you can see the serrations in that beak. And that's how they cut food. When they eat plant material, those serrations help them cut it so that they can break it off. What we have to remember when we try to figure out why did these ideas come to Darwin when they hadn't come to other people, we didn't have nature television. It didn't exist in Charles Darwin's days. And most people only saw the animals that they lived with in their own neighborhood. Charles Darwin was in a unique position. He made a 5-year trip on the famous vessel called the Beagle, and he saw biological diversity across the surface of the earth. That's why the Galapagos is such a wonderful place, because actually we can still see enough of this natural variability to understand how these processes work.
One World will be right back. Darwin spent 5 years as a naturalist aboard the Beagle, 1831 to 1836. It was another 23 years before he turned these observations into his classic on the origin of species. Up until that time, it was generally believed that each species of plant and animal had independent ancestry since creation, rather than sharing common ancestry as we know today. To the established religious order, Darwin was unleashing the hounds. This young man, who actually had a degree in divinity, began to see profound variations in everything on this one world. All the creatures God created, he seemed to recreate over and over again. Living things evolved. Basically, all this can be extrapolated to mean, if it took God 6 days to do the job, then he spent every day since tweaking. And each time he's made things more adapted to the ever-changing environment, better suited to find food, to avoid being food, and to make babies. Today, biologists have transitional fossils, an understanding of genetics, embryology. 150 years ago, Darwin just had curiosity, imagination, vision. Here's what he saw. The island's namesake, the giant Galapagos tortoise. As big as anyone can imagine, living to be 100, 150, maybe more. No one really knew how old, they just knew that Los Galapagos were there before they were. Darwin also saw a land of very strange and tame lizards, sea lions to step over, enormous seabirds, all with absolutely no fear of humans, and finches, lots of finches. It wasn't just the uniqueness of the species here that got Darwin's attention, but the fact that they shared characteristics with similar species on the mainland. It led, of course, to his theory of natural selection. So, a group of finches fly to the Galapagos. They end up on different islands. Even though they're the same bird, their beaks are slightly different depending on what their food source. Is that right?
That's right. The Darwin's finches, as we call them now, actually, dependent upon the diet of the bird, the beaks are specialized. Different shaped beaks, not just on different islands, but even on the same island, and have different ecological roles. Large beak ground finches, which have to crush big, heavy seeds, have big, heavy bills, very strong bills. There has to be variation. So what Charles Darwin did was he actually used the Darwin's finches as a model when he tried to explain his ideas about the process of evolution by the means of natural selection. He thought of finchness and how finches could be a model after he'd left the Galapagos Islands. When he was here, what caught his attention were tortoises, mockingbirds, and some of the other animals that aren't quite as variable as the finches. Later on, when he finished his trip, got back to England, spent many years thinking about this stuff, doing experiments on dispersal, and then as he began to write about it and try to figure out how can I explain this to a doubting world, he used the finches as a model. And one of the things that Charles Darwin did experimentally was try to figure out how animals could get to a place like the Galapagos. Big animals like these tortoises, they can float. Now, animals that have high metabolic rates, mammals, they can't float across the ocean. And so when you get to a place like Galapagos, you don't see very many mammals. You see a lot of reptiles because they're good at floating. You see a fair number of birds because they can fly. And so an oceanic archipelago has gaps in the animal life that occurs there. And some of those gaps are usually mammals and big predators. And that's why these animals are so tame. These tortoises have no natural enemies when they reach this size. So we can sit here among them, and they have no fear of us. I kind of worry about if they'll step on my toes or not. But aside from that, it's all that process of partial isolation that makes a place like Galapagos work in terms of evolution and made it such a wonderful model for Charles Darwin to come learn about it first and then use it to explain the process to the rest of the world. This process of natural selection can happen quick enough that people can measure it. Peter Grant has measured natural selection in finches many, many times. Other workers have measured the process of natural selection in lizards. The famous example of the moths in England that began to change color based on the preponderance of industrial pollutants, and they became blacker. So natural selection can happen very fast. So when there's a variable environment and there's a variable organism within that, can be a plant, can be an animal, whatever it is, some of those individuals are going to be better at getting food and better at reproducing than others. They're going to produce more offspring. So the next generation will have more of that variation. And then as time goes on, actually create a species. That's actually been done in the laboratory. It's been done in the laboratory with some species of fruit flies by a guy named Bill Rice. So natural selection can happen very fast.
I'm noticing that these tortoises in here are all a little different. What is it about them?
There's two basic shell shapes. One that we call domes, those are curved, rounded. That's what most tortoises look like. And some that are saddlebacks. The saddlebacks have a very high front to the shell. Now that high front to the shell allows a small tortoise to have great vertical reach. The tortoises can reach higher up and get food when the environment gets dry. And it turns out that probably the primary moving force in evolution in the Galapagos, or natural selection in the Galapagos, probably has to do with dry, stressful periods for food. Most of these species of animals have got something special that they can do that helps them get through very, very long periods of low availability of food, tremendously low availability of water. These tortoises can starve for a year and survive without any external source of food. It's just amazing.
What about water?
Water, again, they can store water for a long, long time. And one of the guys that works at the research station, a man named Cruz Marquez, has found some of these Galapagos tortoises, at the end of a dry period, a tortoise might weigh 300 pounds. You give it 6 months of rain, and that tortoise can weigh 400 pounds. It can gain 100 pounds of water and store that in its tissues and in its body, and then use that stored water to live for a long, long time. Natural selection as the primary means of biological evolution is simply not an issue anymore. I mean, it's not a theory, it's not in doubt, it's a fact.
These days, Darwinians and creationists seem to get along just fine. And yes, most folks agree that you can still believe in evolution and not be sent to hell, or even be turned into a tortoise. Next on One World.
This tortoise is Lonesome George. Now, Lonesome George is a symbol of what can go wrong in a place like the Galapagos Islands. The first visitors to the islands were whalers, sealers, a bunch of people that came here in boats, and they removed tortoises to use as food. Now, all these populations were evolutionarily distinct. And then in the last 100 years, fishermen and other people removed more tortoises from Pinta. And what we're looking at right now is the last tortoise from the island of Pinta. That's actually the last tortoise.
Wow. One World will be right back. These are the giant Galapagos tortoises, and they can live to be 100, maybe 150 years old. In fact, it's not inconceivable that some of these creatures were here when Darwin was here. This guy is the rarest animal on Earth. That's according to Guinness. His name is Lonesome George, the last of the Pinta subspecies of Galapagos tortoise. Only one. That's it. The Galapagos were a staging area for the great whale hunts. The whalers would stop off at the Galapagos to load water and supplies, and tortoises, hundreds for each ship. They'd stack the animals 3 or 4 deep in the hold, upside down, and the poor things would seem to live forever, without water, months at a time. At the turn of the century, the Pinta tortoises were almost completely wiped out, and when George passes, that last pirate soul is lost. The subspecies is extinct.
There's some chance that there could be another tortoise from Pinta in a collection in a zoo somewhere in the world or in a private collection. And there's a real faint chance that there can still be a tortoise on Pinta. We really haven't removed that possibility.
I see 2 other tortoises in there with George. Who are they?
Those are 2 females from a population that is morphologically very similar to the tortoises from Pinta. If we can find a female, mate Lonesome George to that female, then we can actually restore the tortoises from Pinta. Some people feel that George is sexually dysfunctional and that, we need to somehow or another have a program to train George into being a sexually functional tortoise. I suspect that it actually could be what you suggested, is that George realizes that these tortoises aren't attractive to him because they're not from his population. Another thing that happened on Pinta, Pinta's a very remote island. It's off in the northern part of the archipelago. And fishermen introduced goats onto Pinta Island so that when they were out there fishing, they would have something to eat because the tortoises were pretty well gone. And so as the goat population exploded, and goats tend to eat a lot more vegetation than a tortoise can, and the island became relatively denuded. And so the few tortoises that remained couldn't recuperate very well. The population couldn't recuperate because there wasn't food for the juveniles.
So how old is he?
He was found in 1971, and he was an adult of that size. We know that to reach that size, with the growth rates that you would see on a place like Pinta, would take at least 40 years. So he's a minimum of 70 years, and I suspect he could well be quite a bit older than that. So what we have is almost extinction. In other words, if that tortoise was to die, then the species of tortoise from the island of Pinta would be gone from the earth forever.
By the way, Lonesome George is also E.T. Really, he was the inspiration for Steven Spielberg. Except George can't phone home. There's nobody there.
It's very early days for marine conservation, but there is definitely a growing sense internationally. Everyone knows the pressures that are being faced by the world's oceans. We're putting too much into the ocean, we're taking too much out, and we're now having to start to readdress that very quickly. We're working on a system of marine national parks for Victoria's coastal waters. 13 fully protected marine national parks and 11 smaller fully protected marine sanctuaries. What we're doing here is a world first. These areas would cover approximately 5.5% of the state's coastal waters. The dive industry, the scientific community, conservation groups right across the state have worked 10 long, hard years to try and have these marine national parks established, and it's great that finally these areas have come to fruition. It doesn't make sense just to have one reserve. You need a network of them if you're going to in fact have the benefits accruing. So a systematic approach is really important.
My name is Bill Ballantyne. I work at the university's marine laboratory just up the road here, and I've been interested in promoting marine reserves for the last 40-odd years. When we started, the first idea was that it would be nice to have somewhere where people didn't eat our experiments. But after a short time of public discussion, it broadened a lot, and we ended up with the notion that it would be good for many reasons to have places that people didn't disturb. Not just no fishing, but no reclamations, no dumping, no dredging, just leave it alone. So the first meeting I called was the local commercial fishermen. I suppose about a dozen came up and we sat round and had a beer. Half of them said it was the best idea since sliced bread, and the other half said they'd kill us. I mean, fishermen never have wishy-washy views on things, but it's proved very popular. So we took it to the country, and New Zealand now has 16 marine reserves, and the minister said she hoped for another dozen or so in the next few years.
Mi nombre es Roberto Flores Castrejón. Estamos en Isla Mujeres, en La Tortugranja. What we're doing here is protect these endangered species from natural predators, but mostly from people. We got about 24,000 rooms in Cancun. Right now, that's a big challenge. Like the tortoises in the Galapagos, the turtles, they've been living here for a million years, and we put them on an endangered list in just 50 years. So I became involved in all this. I love these animals, and I'm sure that we have to do something about them. No matter where you are, the Galapagos and South America and some other places, we have to do something about conservation, and we have to participate.
Marine protection around the world It's really a brand new area. I mean, if you think about it, we've only had the capacity to take humanity into the ocean for about 60, 70 years. We've only been to the deepest part of the ocean a very few times. So there is still a great world out there awaiting discovery.
The Galapagos Islands have always intrigued scientists looking to understand the natural world. And now it's drawing great minds from all corners of the planet to find better ways to protect its wildlife and to manage the resources here. And to take those ideas and apply them to ecosystems everywhere. Once again, the Galapagos Islands are a classroom for all of us in our one world. I'm Olivia Newton-John.